My day began like any other. I woke up early, wrapped in the familiar silence of my home, where the scent of freshly brewed coffee filled the air. The sun, just rising, cast a soft light over the kitchen, and the house felt as still as the outside world. There was nothing but quiet, a peacefulness that always seemed eternal. It was a sense of calm I had come to cherish, something constant and unchanging. But like a crack in glass, something inside me whispered that this tranquility was fragile. The moment I realized it, I couldn't ignore the unsettling thought that my peaceful life was more precarious than I had ever known. Still, I allowed myself to savor those few minutes. The warmth of the kitchen, the soft hum of the world outside, and the comfort of knowing I was home. These simple things gave me a sense of safety. But that feeling, the one I had clung to for years, was about to shatter. Something in the air had shifted, though I couldn't yet put my finger on it. My own thoughts, once so clear and certain, began to feel out of place. I had always taken for granted that things would remain the same, that my home would stay as it was, like a picture frame that never changes. But deep down, I understood that no matter how I tried to deny it, change was already here. It was only a matter of time before it would make itself known. When I returned from my morning walk, something was different. At first, I couldn't quite place it. The house still looked the same. The familiar creak of the floorboards underfoot was the same, but the air had shifted. It felt heavier, thick with an invisible weight, like a storm was coming. I paused in the doorway, looking around, trying to understand the unease gnawing at me. Then I heard him. Jason, my husband. His voice, usually so calm and steady, was tinged with something I hadn't heard before. Panic. I couldn't help but listen as he spoke on the phone, his words sharp and frantic, so out of character. It was clear he was trying to maintain control, but the strain was evident, slipping through in the cracks of his normally even tone. I couldn't make out all the words, but I caught the sharp edge of his frustration, the way his breath quickened between sentences. The man I had shared my life with for so many years suddenly felt distant, like a stranger speaking from the other side of a thick wall. My heart skipped a beat. Jason had always been my anchor, the one I relied on to keep everything stable. But today, the foundation seemed to be crumbling. I stood frozen, listening to him try to calm whoever was on the other end of the line. His voice cracked at the edges, and I felt a chill run through me. The quiet morning, the peace I had been so used to, began to unravel in slow, painful increments. I wanted to go to him, to ask what was wrong, but I couldn't move. I felt an invisible force holding me back. In that moment, I knew something had changed forever. Something beyond my control had begun to unravel, and I had no idea what the consequences would be. What had happened to Jason? And why did it feel like the calm life I had known was slipping away, bit by bit, until nothing would be left but the echoes of what had once been? The door creaked open, and my heart stumbled in my chest when I saw him. Kevin. Jason's son from his first marriage. He had been gone for years, lost in his own world of rebellion and distance, a stranger to our home. But now, there he was, standing in the doorway, his presence filling the space with an unexpected weight. At first glance, he looked like the boy I had once known. The same tall, lean figure, the same tousled dark hair. But he wasn't the same. There was something different about him now. Something sharp in the set of his jaw, a tension in his posture that wasn't there before. His eyes, once youthful and curious, had hardened into something more guarded, more calculating. The years had not been kind, and yet there was an undeniable confidence in him now, as if he had spent all this time learning how to navigate the world on his terms. And somehow it made him seem dangerous. We hadn't spoken in years, not since that awkward holiday dinner when he was just a teenager, his rebellion already simmering beneath the surface. Now, standing before me, he was a man. But a man I barely recognized. His gaze lingered on me for a moment longer than necessary, something unreadable in it. His presence in the room was like a shift in the air, subtle, yet undeniable. I wasn't sure why, but it made me feel exposed, like I was being observed in ways I hadn't expected. Jason, to his credit, tried to act as if everything was fine. He greeted his son with a forced smile, though I could tell he was as uncertain as I was about how this reunion was going to play out. Kevin's response was curt, as if he had no interest in pretending that the years of silence could be easily bridged by a few polite words. It was clear, things between them were far from comfortable. "Dad," Kevin said, his voice colder than I remembered. "We need to talk." The words hung in the air, heavy and foreboding. I watched as Jason's face tightened, the edges of his smile fading into something more serious. This was not a casual visit. There was a history here, one I couldn't see but could feel. Kevin's presence was a catalyst, stirring up something long buried, something Jason clearly hadn't wanted to confront. And then, before I could even think of what to say, Kevin turned his gaze on me. His eyes held mine for a moment too long, as if he was measuring me, taking stock of something I couldn't quite put my finger on. I shifted uncomfortably under his stare, feeling the weight of it in my chest, but didn't know how to break the silence. This was only the beginning, and already I felt like I was standing on the edge of something dark and unknown, something that involved all of us, but was beyond any of our control. Dinner was strained. The air around the table was thick with unspoken words, and every glance seemed loaded with something I couldn't quite grasp. Jason tried to bridge the gap, to make this dinner seem like any other, but his efforts only made things more awkward. He forced small talk, speaking in that familiar, overcompensating way of someone who desperately wanted everything to feel normal, to pretend that the years of separation hadn't taken a toll. But Kevin wasn't having any of it. His answers were clipped, distant, and it didn't take long to see that a deep, unresolved resentment hung between him and his father. Jason would ask a question, and Kevin would respond with one-word answers, as if the conversation itself was an inconvenience. At first, I tried to fill the silence, offering up my own thoughts to ease the tension. But whenever I did, Kevin's gaze would shift to me, his eyes lingering just a little too long, as if I were a puzzle he was trying to solve. I felt his scrutiny like a physical presence, and it made me uncomfortable in ways I couldn't explain. "What about you, Rachel? How's work been?" Jason asked, trying again to steer the conversation into safe territory. I smiled tightly, grateful for the distraction. "Busy, as usual," I replied, keeping my tone light. But before I could say more, Kevin cut in, his voice calm but biting. "You're always so busy, aren't you, Rachel? Always running around, always doing something." The comment wasn't overtly aggressive, but it stung. It was as if he was implying I was avoiding something, hiding behind the busy work of life. My smile faltered, and I glanced at Jason, who seemed frozen, unsure how to respond. I didn't know how to take his words. Was he being deliberately provocative, or was it something deeper, a reflection of the strange tension that had settled in this room, in this house, in all of us? Jason, of course, didn't say anything. He looked between me and Kevin, his face tense, his silence an attempt to maintain control. But it was a control he was losing by the second. Dinner continued, but it felt like we were all just going through the motions. The clinking of silverware on plates, the hum of distant traffic outside, everything seemed so loud in the quiet space between us. Each word that passed felt like a performance, each smile strained. I could feel the distance widening, pulling us further apart, like invisible threads stretching, ready to snap. As the meal drew to a close, I excused myself to clear the table, but Kevin's gaze followed me as I moved around the room. There was something in the way he looked at me, something calculating, almost predatory. It wasn't just the lingering stare, it was the way his lips twisted in a barely perceptible smirk when he thought I wasn't looking. I felt the chill of it settle deep in my bones. The dinner had been a failure, a fragile attempt at reconnection that only highlighted how much had been lost between us. Jason sat there, silent and defeated, as if he too could feel the walls closing in. But neither of us said a word. And Kevin? Kevin just watched, as if he were waiting for something to break. And in that moment, I felt it. The overwhelming sense that everything was on the brink of something I wasn't prepared for but couldn't escape. It was a few days later, when the sun was high and the garden beckoned with its overgrown plants and blooming chaos, that Kevin found me outside. I had been trimming the hedges, the rhythmic snip of the shears a familiar comfort, something that helped clear the unease still hovering in the air. The silence between us had only deepened since that awkward dinner, and I had been trying to avoid him as much as possible. He had an unsettling way of making me feel like I was walking on a tightrope, always just one misstep away from falling. But then he was there, standing beside me without warning. I hadn't heard him approach. "Need help?" His voice was low, measured, and the question sounded too casual for the tension that crackled between us. I looked up, startled, and for a brief moment, our eyes locked. I hesitated, then nodded, unsure why I didn't just walk away. There was something in his gaze that held me there, something I couldn't place. "I could use a hand," I said, trying to sound composed. "The branches keep getting in the way." We worked side by side in silence for a while, our movements synchronized in an odd, almost intimate way. I tried not to notice the way Kevin's presence seemed to fill the space, the way his hands worked with such precision, every motion calculated and sure. It felt as though he was always just a little too close, just a little too aware of me, even though we didn't speak. The air between us was thick with something unspoken, a kind of quiet tension I couldn't escape. Then, in an instant, everything changed. I reached down to trim a particularly stubborn branch, and my foot slipped on the wet earth. I flailed for a moment, the shears clattering to the ground, and then I was falling, my body giving way to the slick soil beneath me. My heart leapt into my throat as I braced for impact, but then his hands were there, grabbing hold of my arms with a force that stopped me midair. For a second, everything was still. His grip was firm, his hands warm and steady against my skin. I could feel the strength in his arms, the way his muscles tensed as he held me, keeping me from falling. My breath caught in my throat, and our eyes met. It wasn't the casual glance we had exchanged before. This time, there was something deeper, something that held us both in place, as if the world had stopped for just a breath. And then, without warning, something shifted. His hands, still holding me steady, seemed to linger longer than necessary. His thumb brushed against my wrist, and my pulse quickened. I felt the heat of his body so close to mine, and for a moment, the world around us faded into the background. It was like everything I had been running from, all the tension, all the unspoken words, had condensed into this one moment. I took a step back, startled by the sudden intensity of it all. His eyes darkened, and the air between us grew thick, charged. I opened my mouth to say something, to break the silence, but the words died in my throat. And then, without thinking, he was closer. His lips met mine, soft but insistent, as if there was no question, no hesitation. It was a kiss that made no sense, that shouldn't have happened, but in that moment, it was everything. I pulled away, my mind spinning, my body frozen in shock. My heart was pounding in my chest and I could barely catch my breath. I didn't want this. I didn't want to feel this. But there it was, a raw, unspoken connection that neither of us could deny, no matter how hard we tried. Kevin stepped back, his expression unreadable. For a moment, neither of us moved. The weight of what had just happened hung in the air, suffocating and undeniable. I didn't know what to say, didn't know how to process it. All I knew was that the quiet, peaceful life I had been clinging to had just shattered, and there was no going back. The following morning, I tried to push everything from my mind. The incident in the garden lingered like a shadow, but I needed to focus on something else. I busied myself with chores around the house, anything to avoid thinking about Kevin, or more specifically, what had happened between us. It was wrong. I knew that. But there was something about the way he had kissed me that I couldn't shake, something that tugged at me with an unsettling force. After breakfast, I went upstairs to sort through some old papers in the office. Jason was on a work call, his voice muffled through the walls. It was the perfect opportunity to lose myself in something mundane, to clear my head. I wasn't looking for anything in particular, but as I dug through the clutter of forgotten documents, my fingers brushed against an old wooden box tucked in the corner of the desk. It was something Jason had left untouched for years, its contents rarely disturbed. I had no reason to think anything of it, but curiosity pulled at me, and I opened it. The first few pages were filled with sketches, simple drawings of landscapes, houses, people, nothing particularly remarkable. But then, as I turned the pages, I saw something that made my blood run cold. It was me, over and over again, drawn in different poses, from different angles. I recognized the way he had captured my moments, the way I held a teacup, the way my hands moved as I brushed my hair, the curve of my smile. Each sketch felt intimate, like a hidden observation of my life, my movements. He had been watching me. I flipped through the pages, each one more detailed than the last. A picture of me sitting on the couch, reading a book. Another of me cooking in the kitchen. A third taken from across the room, showing me standing by the window, lost in thought. The scenes were so lifelike, so accurate, that I could almost feel the weight of his eyes on me as I looked at them. I shuddered, my hand trembling as I held the notebook. But it wasn't just the drawings that unsettled me. It was the writing, the annotations beside each sketch. Some were simple notes describing the moment. Her eyes when she looks at the sunrise, so full of wonder. But others were darker, more cryptic. She doesn't know. She's blind to it. And one, in a jagged scrawl, stood out above the rest. She's mine, even if she doesn't know it yet. The words sent a chill down my spine. It was like a silent confession, a claim he had made over me without my knowledge. I slammed the notebook shut, my heart pounding. I had to stop. I had to get rid of it. But the damage was done. I knew what I had seen, and I couldn't unsee it. Kevin had been watching me, tracking my every move, drawing me as if I were a subject in his own personal story. And it wasn't just an innocent fixation. There was something darker in it, something that left me feeling exposed and vulnerable. I left the office, the notebook still clenched in my hand, and went straight to the kitchen. Jason was there, on the phone, oblivious to the storm I had just discovered. But I wasn't thinking about him. I wasn't thinking about anything but the overwhelming realization that my world had been infiltrated, not just by Kevin's presence, but by something far more unsettling. And there was no way out now. I couldn't look at him the same way again. I couldn't pretend I hadn't seen what was hidden beneath the surface. The calm, familiar world I had known had fractured, and all that was left was the terrifying truth that I was trapped, bound to something I didn't understand but couldn't escape. That afternoon, I found myself in the kitchen, trying to distract myself with the monotonous task of chopping vegetables for dinner. The rhythmic sound of the knife against the cutting board helped to steady my nerves, but just as I was about to reach for the salt, I heard a sound that made my heart leap into my throat. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps behind me. "You can't keep pretending that everything is fine," Kevin said, his eyes narrowing slightly, his tone unnervingly calm. "You know it's not. You know what's happening here." My breath caught in my chest. I didn't know how to respond. I didn't want to admit it, but he was right. The house was falling apart, and I was trapped in the middle of it, trying to hold on to the illusion of normalcy that had long since slipped away. "You don't know what you're talking about," I said, my voice shaking despite my best efforts to sound confident. This isn't what you think it is." "You don't have to pretend, Rachel," Kevin said, his voice low, almost coaxing. "I know what's really going on. I know what you're feeling." His words hit me like a blow to the chest. How could he know? How could he possibly understand? But then, as the weight of his gaze settled on me, I realized something that made my skin crawl. He didn't need to understand. He didn't need to know what I was feeling. He already had his own version of reality, one where he was the center, the one who controlled the narrative. And I had been caught in it without even realizing it. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. All I could do was stand there, facing Kevin, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts that made no sense. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Kevin turned and walked away, leaving me standing there, my hands still gripping the knife, my heart still pounding in my chest. His words echoed in my mind, over and over again. You can't keep pretending that everything is fine. I knew then that I couldn't. I couldn't keep pretending that I wasn't terrified, that I wasn't trapped. But I didn't know what to do, or how to escape the web that was tightening around me. The storm was coming, and this time there would be no way to hide from it.